Under a bruised sky where the desert met the river, the sun sank slow as a dying ember. The wind carried the dry whisper of sage and sorrow, curling around the rocks where a lone cowboy sat beside a grave still raw with red earth. His name was Eli Rawlins, age 30, a man built of silence and sinew, his hat resting in the dust as though even it had grown too heavy to wear. His wife lay beneath the wooden cross he'd carved with trembling hands the night before. He had not cried. Not yet. The West didn't much allow for tears. The river behind him murmured, low, persistent, as if it remembered grief better than men did. He tossed a stone into its current and watched the ripples fade. That's when he heard it, a soft, broken sound carried by the dusk. Not the cry of a coyote, not the moan of wind. Human. He turned. By the far bend of the river stood a young native woman, barefoot, her dress torn and clinging to her like the last remnants of a dream. Her long black hair caught the light like wet silk. She knelt beside a shape wrapped in deer hide, a man's form still and final. Her hands trembled over him, as though she could still call him back from the other side. When she looked up, her eyes found Eli's, and for a moment the entire valley seemed to hold its breath. "Please," she whispered, voice splintered but steady. "Please accept me as your wife. I lost my husband today." Eli didn't move. The river sighed between them, dragging light away grain by grain. He took in the young woman's face, the dust, the blood at her temple, the fire beneath her sorrow. She was Ayanna, age 20, though she looked older in that moment, shaped by loss and the cruel teaching of survival. He rose slowly, boots crunching gravel. "Why me?" he asked. His voice came out rough, more wind than man. "Because you look like a man who already lost everything," she said. Something inside him shifted. Not sympathy, not yet. Recognition, maybe. The quiet knowledge of being emptied out by fate. He studied the horizon where the sun drowned itself in smoke and thought how loneliness always found its mirror. He reached out a hand. She hesitated, then took it, her skin cold as river stones. They walked together toward Dust Creek, a town that sat like a scar at the edge of the wilderness. When they arrived at dusk, the street froze. Men paused mid-spit, women stopped sweeping their porches. Ayanna's presence was an interruption, too human to ignore, too different to forgive. Sheriff Colton Briggs stepped out of the saloon, his badge catching the lamplight. "She don't belong here, Eli," he said, thumb hooked over his belt. "She's my guest," Eli replied. The sheriff's jaw worked like a man chewing on something bitter. "You'd best think on how that looks." "I already have." Eli led her through the silence that followed, past the stairs, past the mutters that bit like sand in the wind. Martha Lynn, the gray-haired innkeeper, stood on her porch with a lantern, her old eyes softening. She didn't speak, but when Ayanna glanced back, Martha gave a faint nod as if to say, "Some hearts remember kindness still." Eli's cabin stood beyond town, near the ridge where the stars seemed close enough to touch. That night, Ayanna slept by the fire while Eli sat awake, hat in his hands, listening to her breath even out. He didn't understand why he'd brought her. Maybe Mercy had been buried too long and wanted out. Maybe he just couldn't stand the sound of his own emptiness anymore. The flames bent low, whispering secrets neither of them could hear. In the days that followed, Dust Creek found its tongue. People whispered in the general store, the blacksmith's, the churchyard. "He's taken up with her," they said. "She's cursed him. She's the reason his wife's gone cold in the ground." Even those who owed Eli their lives crossed the street when he rode into town. Ayanna felt their eyes. When she went for water, children were called back indoors. She pretended not to notice, humming old songs from her people, songs about rivers and endurance. Eli heard her once while fixing the corral fence. The melody cut through the wind like prayer. One evening the sheriff rode up the ridge with 4 men, their horses restless. Eli stepped out to meet them, wiping his hands on a rag. "Evenin', Sheriff." Colton removed his hat. "Eli, this ain't right. Folks are uneasy. They say you keepin' that girl here makes the town look bad." Eli's jaw set. I ain't asked the town to look. Drive her out, Eli, one man barked. We don't want her kind near our women. Eli stared at him until the man's voice faltered. She stays, he said finally, each word heavy as an oath. Any man who don't like it can stop comin' up this hill. The men shifted in their saddles. The sheriff sighed, tipped his hat, and turned away. Dust followed them down the trail like smoke from a slow fire. Inside, Ayanna stood by the window, her hands clasped together. You shouldn't have to fight for me, she said quietly. He looked at her. Don't tell me what I should or shouldn't do. Their eyes met for a long time. Something unspoken hung between them, fragile as morning frost. Later that night, while the wind pressed against the cabin walls, she whispered to the dark, If love is a storm, then let me be the rain. She didn't know if he heard, but she felt his presence on the other side of the thin wooden wall, awake, breathing the same slow ache. A week later, Eli left for a cattle sale in the next county. The morning was gold and quiet. Ayanna stood in the doorway, watching him mount his horse. He tipped his hat to her before riding off, and for the first time, she felt the stir of something soft in her chest, dangerous and impossible. By noon, the peace shattered. 10 townsmen came, half-drunk, full of hate. They didn't knock. They poured into the cabin like locusts. Leave, girl, one shouted. You'll bring sickness on us all. She stood still, voice trembling but firm. This is not your home to break. They smashed the dishes, tore the curtains, split Eli's late wife's photograph down the middle. One man laughed. Ayanna's eyes filled, but she did not cry. She gathered what pride she had left and stepped outside barefoot. The air was cold. The sky looked away. Inside, the cabin crackled with ruin. She sat at the small table, hands shaking as she wrote a note on the only clean scrap of paper she could find. You gave me shelter when no one else would. I cannot let you lose your world again because of me. Forgive me, Eli. She placed it beside his hat, the one he never wore indoors, and walked into the darkening woods. Behind her, the sound of men's laughter faded to nothing. The wilderness took her in without question. When Eli returned 2 days later, the silence told him before his eyes did. The door hung off its hinges, the floor littered with broken glass. He saw the letter, read it once, then again, as though the words might change if he stared hard enough. They didn't. He saddled his horse before dawn, following the faint trail she'd left through the dust. Each hoofbeat echoed in his chest. By sunset, he found her by the river where they'd first met, collapsed among reeds and stones. Her lips were cracked, her skin hot with fever. He lifted her carefully, her head falling against his shoulder. Ayanna, he whispered, his voice breaking for the first time in years. Her eyes fluttered open, barely seeing him. I thought I'd only bring you ruin. Don't talk, he murmured, brushing her hair from her face. You're home now. He rode through the night, carrying her in his arms, the horse's hooves drumming a promise into the ground. Back at the cabin, he stayed beside her bed, cooling her forehead with water, whispering things even he didn't believe yet. You'll be all right. You have to be. The fire burned low, and outside, the coyotes sang the long song of the lost. When dawn came, her fever broke. Sunlight spilled through the cracks in the shutters, soft as mercy. Eli sat slumped beside her, exhausted but awake. He reached for something folded by the hearth, a garment, pale and beaded, woven in red and white. I had Martha make this, he said. A bridal dress. If you'll still have me. Ayanna blinked, tears rising slow and quiet. After all this? He nodded. Because of all this. She dressed, her movements weak but certain. The fabric shimmered as if alive, catching every drop of light. Eli took her hand, led her outside, and helped her onto his horse. Together they rode down to the heart of Dust Creek. The townspeople gathered, curiosity warring with shame. The sheriff stood on the steps of the courthouse, hat in hand. Eli dismounted, his boots sinking into the dust. His voice carried over the crowd. She is my world, he said. And I once lost my world before, but now I won't let anyone take it away from me again." No one spoke. Even the wind stopped to listen. Then Martha Lynn began to cry, openly, without apology. The sheriff lowered his head. Eli turned to Ayanna. "Do you trust me?" "Yes," she said. He smiled faintly. "Then that's all we need." They exchanged vows right there in the square. No priest, no paper, just two souls daring the world to see them. When he kissed her hand, the church bell rang by itself, as though heaven wanted to bear witness. Later, they rode home under a sky the color of forgiveness. The town didn't cheer, but neither did it jeer. Change had begun its slow crawl through their hearts. Seasons passed. The cabin grew warm with laughter and light. Eli built her a garden where the wildflowers bloomed in both English and tribal names. The sheriff sometimes stopped by to share coffee. Children brought her wild berries from the ridge. Even the wind seemed softer. At night, by the same river that first bound them, Eli would watch her reflection tremble in the water. "You saved me," he'd say sometimes. She would smile. "No. We just found each other in the ruins." And if you stood there long enough, you could still hear the faint echo of that first cry carried by the current, the sound of loss turning into life. Because out here, in the vast quiet of the West, love wasn't about taming the wild. It was about standing your ground when the world said no, and daring to say yes anyway.